So the first seminar in this series, and I'm taking this directly from the website, focuses on urban renewal. The idea begins with a rapid urbanization, often not balanced by the construction of adequate urban facilities. This encourages the government to carry out urban renewal or redevelopment processes of an area within the city, such as revitalizing underutilized spaces aimed at creating new infrastructure and restoring economic viability in the area, so that this will attract greater private and public investments. However, the different complexities of the problem involving various stakeholders in each city provide an exciting point in comprehensively understanding the issue of urban renewal. So Dr. Hyungmin from the University of Melbourne will begin this discussion by elaborating on the challenges of urban renewal in Seoul, South Korea. Then this will be followed by Associate Professor Paul Maginn of the University of Western Australia. He'll be presenting on urban renewal and governance in Perth, Western Australia. Then, taking the point of view of revanchist development and grassroots resistance, Dr. Redento Recio from the University of Melbourne, in the corner over there, will reflect on the dynamics of urban renewal in Manila, the Philippines. So we'll kick off with Dr. Hyungmin Kim's presentation entitled "The University Challenges for Urban Renewal, a case study of Siwoon Plaza in Seoul."
Thank you very much for coming to our seminar series. And this seminar series is supported by the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, and we are going to have 4 seminars this year under this title, Australia Asia Dialogue for Urban Innovation. This is the first seminar as part of it. Just in case, I'm just announcing the second seminar, which will be about smart cities, which is scheduled on 8th of May. So if you are interested, please come along. There will be a pretty well known presenters lined up, so you'll find it pretty interesting. Today I'm going to talk about challenges for urban renewal, the case study of Siwoon Plaza. So how many of you have been to South Korea? Just in case? No? Oh, yeah, thanks a lot. This is the central place within Seoul, and Seoul is now like almost 10 million people with a pretty tiny space, and this is the historic center, and you will find it pretty interesting. And if you have any chance to stop over somewhere there, it's really busy in there, because anyway, this is the central place in the district site. This research was supported by the Academy of Korean Studies. And this is a map of central Seoul. The reason why I say this is the central Seoul is there used to be the city wall in the city, and it has more than 600 years of history, and it was surrounded by the mountains, and city walls existed there, although most of them has already gone during the Japanese colonial rule. And the site of the city was selected because of its topography. It was surrounded by the mountains, so it was a good place for defense. And there were traditional palaces where king used to live. And there was not only just one, but several palaces. And you can see another palace here, and the shrine called the Jongmyo Shrine is a major heritage site where the king remembered their ancestors. And there's another mountain on the southern side. And Siwoon Plaza is linking from the north to the south, over one kilometer long. And it has some history. And if you go there, you can find this environment. You can see lots of mountains and heritage site. Indeed, this heritage site is registered in the UNESCO. And then the Siwoon Plaza is located. Before the Second World War, that place used to be just exactly the same to the surrounding areas. And these sites, the Siwoon Plaza site, there was nothing different. from other side. But during the Second World War, there was the policy to avoid and minimize all the possible risks from a bombing attack. So the Japanese governor made an order to vacate those sites. So like 50 meters long and 50 meters wide and 1 kilometer long. That's pretty massive site in the central history area. So it was partly implemented. And in this photo, it is not very clear to see, but this, yeah, you can see still. This part was not the road. It was full of buildings and houses, but because of that risks from the bombing attack, the governor removed and vacated all the buildings, 50 meters wide and along 1 kilometer. So it was vacated, but after going through the Korean War in the 1950s, and there was rural to urban migrants who are looking for the new settlements, and those people were pretty poor and they couldn't afford the formal market, so they just came to the city and they found the vacant site for their settlements. They started building up informal settlements, and these are all informally built. And it was kind of the center for illegal activities and scatter settlements. So all crime activities were found in this area. And the image also shows how the informality was prevailing in the 1960s after the Korean War, and Korea was pretty much one of the poorest countries back then, and they couldn't really afford a formal market, so the place was completely. And there were a couple of plans proposed. This was the first plan, which was not implemented, and this plan was to vacate the informal settlements and to build low-rise buildings along the 1 kilometer. But it wasn't get up. And in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the government was called the developmental state in South Korea, and developmental state is also applied to China, Taiwan, and some other Asian countries where government has played an authoritarian role. Under this developmental state, mayor called Kim played a very important role in modernizing Seoul. In here, the term modernizing is positive and negative. His nickname was bulldozer, and he's saying that city is a line, and the line means he wanted to stress highways and road construction. So during his tenure, the road construction was everywhere, and he covered up the streams and to build the road, and he created elevated highways on top of it, and he's the person who did it. And he worked together with pretty famous architecture called Kim Soo-bun. They are not family members, but they share the same surname. He was highly influenced by the liberal vision, like radiant cities, and he also was impressed by Ellison and Peter Smithson's Streets in the Sky. And these are pretty much the symbol of modernist architecture, and with the mega structure. Building mega structure with mixed-use development, they can create kind of a city in a city. This kind of building was implemented in central Seoul on the vacated site. So the architecture came up with this plan, and he didn't want to include any pedestrian footpaths on the ground floor. It was given to the vehicles, and instead, level 3, here in Australian context, level 2, was allocated for the streets for pedestrians. So it is realizing the streets in the sky, and he just filled all the sites with the buildings, 50 meters and 1 kilometer. this type of building was implemented in Central Seoul. Because this idea was influenced by Le Corbusier. He wanted to make it pretty much mixed-use development. So shops are located in level 2, level 3, and above. And on top of these shops, there will be the residential areas and some shared spaces on the top. This was planned, and it was partly implemented. And all these building blocks should be connected on level 3 for pedestrian activities. This was implemented in 1960s, late 1960s. It was built in this way, surrounded by very small scale buildings. So if you go there, probably this is not this is pretty much out of context, and you will find it pretty different in terms of morphology, contrast to the surrounding areas. This is absolutely the symbol of industrialization and urbanization. And once it was built, it was the center for the electronic hub, like selling some electronic stuff. And residential areas received pretty good attention from the celebrities. And so for the first 10 years, it was pretty flourishing. But after that, it started declining. As you can see in the morphology, it was not very good shape. And this photo is more drastic and surrounded by pretty small grain houses and buildings. And the Seon Plaza was outstanding. It was sitting across 8 blocks. And so those 8 blocks were planned to be linked through pedestrian network on level 3, but it was partly implemented. That means it was connected from this building and that building, but after that, the connection disappeared. It was not fully implemented. And the shops on level 3 were not very flourishing because they also started informal buildings on level 3 instead of pedestrian footpaths. So on the ground floor, this is what you can see scale. It hasn't been changed much. This is the vehicle road and the parking space. On top of the vehicle road, you can see the buildings. It's covered by buildings, and it's pretty shady because of the building. And those stairs are leading to the level 3. In 1990s, still you can see those stark differences in terms of urban morphology. And this one was the Hangul stream, which was pretty well known for restoration. And I explained the Mayor Kim, and he covered up this stream to build the highway construction. It stayed there, and Seon Plaza is linking from north to south. As I said, in the north, there is a heritage site and green space. On the south, you can still find the mountains. And on the right side, what you can see is very outdated buildings. And you can't really imagine the Seoul. This is not typical Seoul. If you go to business centers, the shape is not like this, but still those buildings stay there. And they sold electronic stuff, like they are still selling CCTV stuff, karaoke, and tools. In South Korea, it's very difficult to find burnings like tool shops. The small shops are pretty prevailing, and those are highly concentrated in these areas. And on the left side, you can see the inside of how they manage their business. And those businesses are not very doing well, but they continue their job. Somehow there are some customers, old generations, still go there to repair their karaoke stuff and old electronics. And this is inside of Seon Plaza. These spaces used to be residential areas, but it has been changed to commercial office space. But the design is pretty unique because it was designed in 1960s and it was built influenced by Le Corbusier, and his idea somehow was reflected there. But what I want to present today is the fact irreversibility of mega-scale urban development. Absolutely, this is mega-scale development, but it hasn't been changed much, and it is nearly impossible to rebuild this urban era. There were some proposals to reshape, but these proposals were contradicting with each other. On the left side, one plan was to remove the building, and the other plan was to keep the building, and it continued for a while. The critical challenges could be found twofold. Firstly, land use regulation doesn't allow the profitable development. So in the free market, this large-scale building can't be redeveloped. Why? The current building density is pretty high, as seen in FAR, floor area ratio, which is about 900%. But current regulation allows only 850%. And the building coverage ratio currently is 103%, which is not make sense, which doesn't make sense because building was built on the road and it was extended informally. So it might be pretty difficult to find such building anywhere in the world. But current regulation only allows up to 60%. So once you demolish, what you can have is smaller buildings. So it is not profitable at all. This is the most important barrier. And secondly, there are numerous property owners. So negotiations with the property owners is pretty time consuming. So it's nearly impossible to rebuild this mega structure. So I want to explain these two different approaches. This person is the current mayor. He started his mayor role in 2006. And he's from the right wing. That's why I put his photo on the right side. And he was a mayor for the Mayor Park. He's from the left wing. And the mayor or the right wing started the redevelopment, the Seon Plaza in 2006. And he proposed this plan. And let's make a green corridor. This is main catchment area point. Because the building is so outdated. So we can completely remove to create the building green corridor like this. Probably this is pretty impressive compared to what we have seen from the photo. Oh, sorry, I'll finish.
No, that's you're 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah. And another impression, and I think this seems okay and seems good as a business center, having the green corridor as wide as 50 meters and 1 kilometer long, but it didn't succeed. There are a couple of reasons. Firstly, the strategy to make it happen on the free market was to combine the surrounding block with one of the Seon Plaza buildings. So there were 8 buildings along the Seon Plaza, and he combined the surrounding areas one by one. By doing so, he wanted to even out all the cost for compensation for the Seon Plaza areas, and the landowners in the surrounding areas to share the cost. Instead, they were allowed to build higher density, like super higher, 40, 50 stories, floor levels. And to make it happen, the government wanted to facilitate by leading one building project. So the government compensated this site and changed it to like green space. This is rice farming space. And rice farming is not existing in urban areas, but it's a symbol for green corridor. He did it. He spent $100 million to compensate and build this one. But somehow his tenure just stopped. He couldn't continue his mayor role because of some political battle. And Mayor Park came in and he thought, oh, that's too radical. Let's change the plan. He overturned the plan. The new plan is to preserve the building. And instead, he wanted to create pedestrian network on level 3. So this is revival of the street in the sky. And he also spent $100 million, the same amount, to reconnect the pedestrian network. His idea is pretty much based on grassroots movement. Large-scale development will result in displacement, which is inevitable. He didn't want to. So he wanted to achieve urban regeneration, urban renewal, by retaining existing industries rather than kicking them out. He investigated what is there, and he identified some values from it, and he started working together with owners and shop operators, and he opened up the rooftop, and you can access there, and you can see pretty good views from there. And this is the streets on the sky, which was renewed, and you can see young people. About 10 years ago, they didn't come because it was so outdated. It's so out of the interest amongst the young people. But this is the place where people find it interesting, and they put the cubes around there to attract new creative industries and so on. But all of a sudden, he committed suicide, and he couldn't continue. Then former Mayor O came back, and he overturned this urban renewal approach to create green corridor again. And the plan is underway, and this new plan is kind of replica of what he presented like 15 years ago. So this approach is moving, going forth and back, like seesaw approach. But both of the approaches couldn't avoid any gentrification, and this is what is happening. And you can see high-rise buildings just before very outdated small-scale buildings, and those are not very desirable. And there should be some desirable outcomes. And some areas were abandoned because this site was bought by the developer, and they are waiting for the new development. Probably those sites may be something like these high-rise buildings. And this one was pretty interesting. The Mayor Park wanted to retain those current existing shop operators. So this is temporary, the relocation center. Those industry operators move to this space if they experience urban redevelopment once the site was bought by the developer. And one large building site was completely bulldozed. It was government-led. And it was part of the farm rice park, was combined with the site. The government development agency is doing this one. But you can see in this plan, you can see two contradictory approaches. The bridges are linked to the streets on the sky, and green network was built, and like high and medium-sized buildings and large-scale buildings are planned to be built. And I assume it will be completed in 5 or 7 years' time. And because of those developments, some people were relocated, but from the investigation, they still found Central Seoul within 1 kilometer radius boundary. That means they didn't want to go far away. They want to continue their business operations, but the same plaza around that area is not available, so they found somewhere nearby. So I would like to conclude. The large-scale modern development is de facto irreversible without government investment. It's very difficult to redevelop. This is what I have observed. And how to respond to changing socioeconomic trend is pretty important. And city is not a line. And city is much more complex. It was probably accepted in 1960s, 70s when motorization started, but it is kind of something that we are against with. And never-ending gentrification is happening. So we can see the significance of public policy. Yeah. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. As mentioned, we'll keep the question time towards the end. So we'll follow with the next presentation from Associate Professor Paul Maginn He's Associate Professor in Public Policy, Department of International Relations, Asian Studies and Politics at the University of Western Australia. His presentation title is The Shifting Sands of Urban Renewal and Governance in Perth, Western Australia. So Paul, same deal, that the alarm will ring at 15 minutes, giving you warning that you have 5.
Okay, excellent. Well, first of all, let me pay my respects to the Indigenous owners of the land that we're meeting on today. So I've come from Perth, and this is an aerial shot of looking down the west coast down to Scarborough, and you'll see there here, if this works. I'm going to work on this screen. This is one of the major kind of redevelopment sites, the Scarborough Beach, which the Redevelopment Authority in Perth was responsible for. And I wanted to use this image obviously to speak to the kind of the title and web kind of notion of shifting sands. So what I'm going to try to do is get through all of these issues. And so it's going to be a kind of a rapid historical evolution of urban governance, urban regeneration governance in Perth. So just thinking about what Min's comments, I suppose there's a variety of ways that we might interpret what urban renewal or urban regeneration or redevelopment or renaissance. There's been a whole bunch of terms which have been used to describe transformations which happen within cities or metropolitan regions. And I think these different kind of notions, these different R's, the 5 R's that are here, speak to notions around what Talon talks about, the people-centered dimension of regeneration, the place-centered dimension of regeneration, and then ultimately, I think, the economic dimensions of regeneration as well. So I think when we think about reconstruction, we're largely thinking of kind of that physical dimension of regeneration, whereas, you know, if we kind of move into something like Renaissance, then we're talking probably about urban branding and urban entrepreneurism probably at a mega scale in a way, and like operating in this kind of global level. And for me, thinking about kind of, I suppose, modern urban regeneration, it probably starts with the Building Better Cities program. And this map gives an idea of kind of the amount of money that the Building Better Cities program was allocating. So this is a relationship between the federal government and state governments in the early 90s. So the total amount of money that was being given by the national government was a paltry $816 million. Now, it's paltry in today's figures because there's one regeneration project in Perth, the Gateway project near the airport, which cost us about 1.4 billion just for one project. And here's the federal government looking to dish money out around the country to metropolitan regions and also some regional areas. This gives you an idea of the number of projects and the volume of money and the percentage share of that money. So in overall terms, 82% of total funding went to metropolitan regions, basically projects within metropolitan regions, which is, interestingly, the proportion share of the population in Australia. Metropolitan regions account for around about 80% of the population. So the funding is matching with the population. And in Perth, we had 4 kind of projects that were donated money, but only one really kind of stands out in people's imagination, and that's the East Perth redevelopment area. But since I suppose the evolution of the Building Better Cities program, there have been a series of redevelopment corporations emerged in Western Australia. And they really take their cue from the UK model, where the Docklands Corporation really kind of started. And there was an incremental evolution of different areas becoming these redevelopment authorities or redevelopment corporations. The first one being East Perth in 91, and then 94, we moved to Subiaco, another inner city location. And then we move out a bit towards the suburbs with both the Midland and the Armadale redevelopment. And underpinning this evolution, of course, is there's an economic imperative, but there's a political imperative going on as well, basically. And particularly with Armadale, for example, the Minister for Planning at the time just happened to be hold the seat for Armadale. So there's kind of interesting questions there around kind of political nepotism in terms of urban regeneration. So this is East Perth. This is looking westwards, and so the area in the foreground here. So the East Perth area is basically all of this land here, and this was a gasworks initially, and then it became abandoned. And it's the edge of the city, and it was also a gathering place for the Noongar people in Perth. But they had to leave there at 6 o'clock because they weren't allowed in the city after 6 p.m. And so there's been massive kind of redevelopment of this area. So just to give you an idea of the extent of it. And if we look towards the west, and I use this photograph because it's a little bit older. That big vacant site there is where Optus Stadium actually sits. So this is part of this kind of sports regeneration. This is part of Renaissance type of regeneration. And if you've ever been to Perth and you go to Optus Stadium, it's called the Bird's Nest because of its architectural design. I mean, this area has been fundamentally redesigned. The stadium used to be in Subiaco, but it was relocated here by the former Liberal Premier, and it just so happens to be beside the casino as well. So there's an economic synergy going on here in terms of kind of, let's call it tourism, with different things happening basically. So this is the Subiaco redevelopment area. It kind of was really, I suppose this is a Todd type of redevelopment. At the town centre, they sunk the railway line, which heads out towards Fremantle, and there was a cut and cover tunnel that was built. It wasn't a boring tunnel, it's not like it's right underground because the water table and other engineering feats. But it kind of, Subiaco is this inner city western suburbs, quite a wealthy area, but it had been largely an industrial area, and it was time for kind of renewal and change of it. It's more or less been completed, and just recently there's I think it's a 30-story apartment complex, which is on the corner of Rockaby Road, right near the train station, towers now above the old redevelopment site basically, and this was done by a private developer. And this is setting in a catalyst for further investment. So in terms of the evolution, what's happened, there's been a consolidation of the kind of the urban governance. Instead of having 4 redevelopment authorities, we now have, we moved to having a single redevelopment authority, what's called the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority. There was an act for it. It's quite a detailed act in terms of what it can do. But fundamentally, what it enabled was the MRA could actually now go to any area within the metropolitan Perth and put a regeneration scheme over the top of it if it felt that an area needed to be regenerated. And by that, it could also then take that land out of the control of local governments. So we see a kind of a major centralization of governance power and the regeneration power happening through the establishment of the MRA Act. And this is the MRA. It started in its first year. It started in 1st of January 2012. And it maintained its operation initially for the 4 redevelopment areas, but of course, being granted all this additional power, power begets power. So it started to, reach out its tentacles and started taking up other areas, of which Scarborough Beach was one of those particular areas. Because Scarborough Beach it's a tourist precinct within Perth and in Western Australia. It's not quite Gold Coast, but it's got, I suppose, in a sense, it's kind of might have some aspirations to kind of be like that in some ways. Although there has been a lot of resistance by local community members and groups who have opposed lots of high-rise density in the area. There were two blocks that were proposed a few years ago, 43 and 33 stories, and they were opposed. But Scarborough is also the hotbed, is the epicenter of Airbnb. So there's a different kind of regeneration going on. I think a more subtle, invisible form of regeneration going on within the housing market. So it's got a kind of classic governance structure, the minister, and there's a board, and there's a chief executive officer. So it's got a very corporatized approach to its governance. So the minister has kind of call-in powers and is the ultimate authority, but significant power is invested in the CEO. The other interesting thing about the MRA, it is both a developer and the planning regulator in its own right. So it can effectively approve its own development. It has this kind of power. It needs to go to the minister for, to get the nod from that. But as soon as the minister created the MRA, there's a tacit automatic support for what that MRA is there to do. It's changed its changed its emphasis in terms of its overall approach. It describes its approach as a kind of a place-making approach. And you'll see here the three kind of elements of its overall strategy is one that's got about place management, development processes, and regulatory processes as well. So it is trying to consolidate regeneration processes to make things more efficient, decision-making more efficient. There has been a big agenda in Western Australia since the Liberals, well, before the Liberals got into power in 2008, but cutting red tape is a kind of a common trope in governance speak in Western Australia, and the creation of the MRA is a way of doing this and speaks to wider cutting red tape within the wider planning system as well. So the jewel in the crown, in many senses, has been in the various places that are being regenerated in Perth, is Elizabeth Quay, and these were the initial plans which were drawn up. These were the initial visions which were drawn up, and I think these in some ways speak to Min's imagery that was put up by the mayor, who had the fantastic ideas. And these proposals came from the architectural group ARM, and they were seen as pretty dramatic for Perth. Perth, at the time, quite conservative city, and this project, this vision was named Dubai on Swan because it was kind of seen as reflective of the architectural developments that were happening in Dubai. A more kind of sanguine kind of plan has emerged over time, very typical, very kind of, I see these as glass coffins in many senses, which is in keeping with the architecture in Perth. Lacks a lot of imagination in many senses, I think, in terms of actually quite like this because it's going out on a limb in many senses. I mean, it might be going too far in some senses, but I think you've got to go far in terms of if you really don't want to make kind of change and difference in some way. So we've ended up with this kind of, I think, quite boxy kind of regeneration project being proposed. And there's again, political trouble around the naming of it. It was named Elizabeth Quay because Chogham was being held in Perth in 2011. The Premier at the time, Colin Burnett, who was a Liberal, wanted to pay homage to Queen Elizabeth II, so that's why it's called Elizabeth Quay. There was a Noongar name proposed for it, but that didn't get in the running. Instead, a Noongar name was used for a project which is further north, just behind the main CBD in Northbridge, which is called Huagin Square, and again, more politics around that. So this is what the site actually kind of looks like, and it is pretty, it's made quite a dramatic change over time, and it's still being developed out. These sites here in the foreground are now got developments on them, and they're nearing completion, and there's another one that has been built on this block as well, which is called One the Esplanade, and it's a place, it's one place for all apparently, despite the fact that it's a luxury development basically. So interesting kind of rhetoric kind of being used. And here's just the original kind of master plan vision of things originally. So in terms of the MRA, it maintained its redevelopment areas, but as I said earlier, it kind of started to, its tentacles started to reach further around Perth. And I'll just skip this one. It's reflected in the range of projects that then have come under its ambit, basically. And if we kind of look at the scale of the investment that's going on, so it's now up to around about $20 billion across these projects. So roughly it's about for every $1 of state government, you're getting around about $4.2 of private investment coming in return thereabout, basically. And so it's been kind of pretty significant. A number of these projects are nearing completion. One of them, which I'll come to at the end, the East Perth Power Station, has floundered yet again. That's what I'm going to end on. So in terms of other governance, the other major player in things in Perth was Landcorp, and it was really the old state development corporations who were responsible for industrial development, but also bringing in very marginalized lands into the market for other developers to actually do things too. But Landcorp has become a developer in its own right. And ultimately, over time, it has both a metropolitan and a regional focus, so it's got a much larger spatial remit in terms of what its focus is on. But interestingly, we had another consolidation, basically. So Landcorp and the MRA were merged into one super organization, which is called Development WA, and that's the case they take into consideration both the metropolitan and the regional context within Perth. So here's the minister, former treasurer Ben Wyatt, who's an Ingar, launching the kind of the Development WA to say that they'll play a future role in shaping not just the metropolitan region where most activity was, but the broader state as well. So Development WA is an amalgamation of these two organizations, but there's a curious setup in them in that there has been no new act to consolidate this organization. They actually both operate still under their previous acts, which caused some initial administrative headaches when both organizations were administered, and some tensions between both organizations. But it seems now that those things have settled down. But I think there are still some legal technicalities about whether or not we actually have these things are produced by Development WA or they're actually being produced by Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority. So there's that kind of nuance in that. So in terms of kind of where they're going, the Development WA has, I suppose it's taken on a much more comprehensive view of things, and it's one of the positive moves in this development is it's at least in policy rhetorical terms, it's turned to the notion of sustainability, and it lists its objectives and so forth, and tries to benchmark them against SDGs, which I think is a pretty important move for an organization like this to actually put that up front in its agenda, and in its annual reporting, it puts forward how it's doing along the various SDGs. And you can see here, I just picked out the ones that I think which are particularly central to regeneration, but affordable housing and so forth. I mean, it's a bit of the normal kind of regeneration speak that you hear. The unfortunate thing, there's never been any evaluation of how these things have actually played out. Are they delivering on all of these fronts? I mean, has there been there's no independent evaluation of things. So flipping the turnaround a little bit, suburban regeneration, most of what I've looked at has been urban regeneration. Suburban regeneration has come in the form of MetroNet, which is the expansion of the public transport network in Perth. So this is 72 kilometers of extra heavy rail and new station precincts around the metropolitan region, basically. I'm just going to zoom in on one. It's got an interesting interagency governance structure. Interestingly, it privileges the private sector more than anything else, which isn't surprising because the language is all about value capture. Precinct stations are about not just providing a station so people can get on and off a train, or it's an interchange for trains and buses, but it's obviously paying for this. It needs to be done by developing the land in and around these stations, basically. But there is some acknowledgement of social issues, and there is an access and inclusion reference group. And so it's got a massive range of stations which are going on across the metropolitan region. I just want to zoom in on one. And this is the one which is close to my heart because I live here and I'm kind of experiencing this. I just live further around the bend here. This is Bayswater Station. So in and around here, this is the station, and this is the kind of the precinct. There's retail here. So the old bridge has just recently been taken out, and this is what's been put in its place. We call these sky bridges. We've got very efficient at building elevated bridges in Perth, and this cuts, it's like a massive scar that cuts through this suburban area, but it's a deliberate ploy. You can kind of see it here in relation to on the right-hand side, here. Here's a shopping precinct, the shopping precinct, and then this thing just cuts this massive scar through the suburban fabric. And the aim is basically where those shops are now will become apartment complexes. This is what this is all about. This is all about densification as well. Just ending on the East Perth redevelopment or the East Perth Power Station. So I've called this urban degeneration because although there have been numerous plans for this site, I suppose it's a bit like the power station in London. The aim is to try to create this space, but unfortunately this site was a partnership between Forest and Stoke, so two magnates. So a mining magnate and a media magnate in Perth, but they fell out with one another recently, and now the project has fallen on its face again, basically. So, and here's the kind of the notion of it, this massive fallout. But just to conclude, and this is just some stuff that I've just recently published, more looking at kind of suburbanisms, but looking at Min's topic, and he was talking about mega regeneration projects and the visions that are created with the renderings in his examples and also mine. I think what we can see here is that we talked about kind of the creation of different types of landscapes within when we have regeneration projects. And I think all of these landscapes are actually coexist simultaneously because of the different scales that we're operating at when we are doing urban regeneration or metropolitan regeneration as well. So I'm going to end there.
So please just hold on to your questions. We have one more presentation. Dr. Redento Recio, who poses the question, renewal for whom? Redento is a research fellow at the faculty.
Thanks, Sidh, and thanks, Min, for organizing this very relevant series. So only still uploading the presentation because I have a video, so we'll see if the sound will cooperate. Well, I'll probably start by saying that there are two key factors that probably differentiate the context.
We believe every estate should be more than just a cluster of.
So the Philippine context is different from the two previous presentations because of two factors. One, urban renewal operates in a context where state resources are strained. Second, poverty and inequality are entrenched, particularly in metropolitan Manila. And I would be touching on some of the wider political issues, but also micro political agency of some urban pool networks we've been collaborating with for the past few years in Metro Manila. And that's why I titled my presentation, Revanchist Renewal and Grassroots Resistance in Manila, the Case of Cities and Rocket. So I'll be starting with a video that would somehow show you the complexity, but also the aspiration of some of the grassroots networks there.
We believe every estate should be more than just a cluster of places, but a community that thrives. That's why we'll keep building. We've broadened our residential offerings so that more people can have a home, to enhance land, to enrich lives, So let's co-create the future. Ayala Land.
Hindi kasama ang maralita sa pagpapaunlad. Kaya merong nagaganap na demolition at itinataboy sa malalayong relokasyon. Ang gusto ng komunidad ay kilalanin ang karapatan namin na magkaroon kami ng pabahay na on-site development na abot kaya namin mahihirap. Ang nagdidisenyo kasama sa mga architect ay yung community mismo. Kailangan kasing sama-samang kumilos kasi doon ang malakas. Sama-sama naming ipagtanggol ang karapatan namin sa paninirahan at kabuhayan.
Unity Development Plan. Ito ang planong binuo mismo ng komunidad ng Sitio San Roque. On-site, malapit sa mga paaralan, ospital, pamilihan, at higit sa lahat, sa trabaho at kabuhayan. Disente at abot kaya para sa lahat. Kaunlaran na walang maiiwan. Sitio San Roque, ang puso ng Quezon City.
Okay, so
Sa laban ng Community Development Plan. Tara na!
the first part of the video was actually a promo material by Ayala, which is the developer, one of the largest, if not the largest and oldest real estate companies in the country. And that promo material was tampered with by some of our volunteer architects, educators, who tried to really push for, and still trying to push for this campaign for community development. So you saw some of the outputs. We brought students, Unimab students in 2020, about 15 students, and some of the outputs were actually integrated into some of the outputs here. So what's the wider context? Why did the community resort to this kind of community development initiative? So in the Philippines, there is this National Housing Authority, which is mandated to provide adequate, safe, and affordable housing to the low-income families, you know, the poorest of the poor, supposedly. And there are three main programs that they've been implementing. One is to provide housing units to informal settlers living along danger areas. So I put them in quotation because danger areas are a very contested notion in the Philippines. Like the state can assign one community to be part of a danger area if they want to introduce redevelopment, or if they cooperate with some commercial establishment or real estate. Then they are also providing housing units to the uniformed personnel of the state. Resettlement for indigenous members of the indigenous community and disaster-affected communities. Now, that's why I began by saying that, you know, urban renewal in the context of Metro Manila occurs in a context where you have strained state resources. So the fourth mandate is to come up with what they call high impact projects. So they do this to invite some large corporations that would invest real money, like billions of pesos, in order to generate more state resources. And they would use those resources to supposedly build more housing units for the low-income families. And North Triangle area, which is where San Roque is located, is one of those high-impact projects that NHA has been implementing for, I think, over a decade now. So it's called the Gateway of Urban Mixed Use north of Metro Manila. So Crystal has been there. She was with us when we had the traveling studio about 3 years ago now, before the pandemic hit. And we met some of the leaders, community leaders you saw in the video. In 2009, the NHA, in their desire to bring in more capital from local investors, they entered into a joint venture agreement with Ayala. As I said, probably the biggest real estate company in the country, to develop 30 hectares of that North Triangle property in Quezon City. Quezon City is the biggest component city of Metro Manila. And the aim is to, as I said, to benefit NHA in achieving its mandate to provide housing supposedly for informal settlers, but more importantly, to transform what they call non-performing asset into a model for urban renewal. Again, the notion of non-performing asset here is very much contested because that site has been home to more than 9,000 families. And you multiply that by 5 to 6 members per family, that's the average family size in the country. We're talking about more than 40,000 people being accommodated by the area. And yet it's considered to be a non-performing urban asset. In planning context in the country, every local development should go through local planning process. That means the Quezon City government has to be the one facilitating the planning process. But they did away with that process by assigning that portion. This is the area where San Roque is located. So this one. So they enacted a local ordinance assigning that area as part of the special urban development zone, which would be subject to real estate and government agreement. So it's now free from the local intervention, the usual local development process within the city. It's now like the NHA and the Ayala deciding the development plan without the significant participation of the local government, because they have practically assigned them to develop the area. Now, the thing is, before they entered into that joint venture agreement, previous presidents already promised San Roque residents that they're going to own the land eventually. Erap Estrada, the one on the left, before he was ousted by a middle-class led people power in 2001, he visited the community, and he knew then that these urban poor people were his allies, his political allies. They voted for him. So he promised them this land would be individually titled and they would eventually be owned by the residents here. A year or 2 years after, as I said, the middle class revolt ousted him, but the urban poor went to EDSA, the venue of the protest, to defend Estrada. But when he was out of power already, Arroyo, the lady president, I think of about 3 months into power, she visited the area as well, and she knew that these people were pro-Estrada. So she brought with her the social welfare secretary, and again, she promised that, hey, just try to relax, and you would be owning this property soon, because they would be individually titled. And yet, 8 years, 9 years down the road, Arroyo led the agreement or facilitation of the agreement between Ayala and NHA. So of course, the residents felt betrayed. They were like, oh, what's happening here? So for more than a decade now, they've been resorting to different forms of resistance. This is actually a documentation made by one of our Manila traveling studio in 2020. So she documented, their group actually documented the different forms of, in a way, manipulation resorted to by the NHA Ayala Alliance. And then those forms were also met with different forms of resistance by various organizations on the ground. There's no time to dwell on each of the resistance form, but I would try to touch on some of the issues here. So this was how the community looked like from above in 2010, a few months after they entered into the joint venture agreement. Then in 2011, the government tried to resort to violent demolition. So they sent troops, uniformed personnel, to demolish the housing structures. What did the community do? They were quite united then. They put up what they call human barricade. They occupied the busiest thoroughfare in Metro Manila. They were there for like 6 hours. So there was traffic gridlock. And that forced the president then, not Arroyo, the next one, Aquino, to, in a way, enter into negotiation. And the demolition was halted. Because of that, the NHA Ayala resorted to a new strategy, which we have called the incremental eviction. So there's no violent demolition, but what they've been doing is to convince residents to self-demolish their structures, and then in return they would be receiving compensation package, like not much really. At that time, ranged from 15,000 to 20,000, which is about 400 to 500 or 600 Australian dollars per family. And then they need to relocate outside Metro Manila. So that's the deal. And that kind of strategy somehow succeeded. Because especially the most needy families, they took the compensation package. They self-demolished, they went to the relocation area of NHA. And that also, in a way, fragmented the different community organizations, because you have organizations pushing for on-site redevelopment, but some leaders were also convinced that, hey, we can probably take the financial package and convince our members to move to this relocation site. Okay, so it's in a way very effective. On the ground, this is how it looks like. You know, you have you still have some housing units owned by families belonging to organizations that insist on on-site redevelopment as their option. So, and then some activists have used the area to, you know, promote the campaign. So, para kanino, no to demolition. It's development for whom, no to demolition. They also resorted to fencing. So once your area, once you have self-demolished, they would come in, they have security guards fencing of the area so that they can protect it from re-encroachment. Because some of them, after relocating, they go back as well. They realize there's no social service. There's no set of social services in the relocation area, so they go back to the informal settlement. These are the different community organizations. As I said, they used to be very united. They were unified in coming up with a human barricade. So 5 organizations, sorry, 6. And they have fractured already. There are different campaign positions now. So there are still 2 groups pushing for on-site redevelopment when I was there a year ago, but even then were somehow convinced that it's probably more politically palatable to push for in-city relocation because the NHA has not been involving them in the series of negotiations. So this is the San Roque area, and you would see that some of the relocation sites are really far from Metro Manila. That's why they've been opposing it. It would take you 2 to 3 hours of commute to get to the employment area. So most of them are employed as street vendors, janitors, or even call center agents in the area or in the malls close to the San Roque community. Some of the issues in the relocation sites, that's why they've also been opposing this option. So very unaffordable. If you look at their income and monthly amortization, it's really unaffordable for them. They lose their livelihoods, the livelihood opportunities available in the city, in the CBD. Then of course the social networks that they have built through decades. I said already the time-consuming and costly commute and lack of social services. Some of them have been complaining that you're considering some of the areas as danger areas, but now you've relocated us to what they've called death zones because there's no opportunity for livelihood and there are no social services available. And here you have the Save San Roque Alliance assisting the community residents and the community groups in trying to develop the alternative plan. So you already saw some of the outputs in the video. Some of the things they considered in trying to come up with a viable alternative plan. So the capacity to pay for monthly amortization, the social cohesion, and the actual needs on the ground. And of course, the facilities needed for some social interaction. When I was there in 2019, I was fortunate to witness some of the workshops. And overall, when I asked them, there were more than 10 consultation workshops that they conducted in order to generate the sentiments and the aspirations from the community leaders and residents themselves. During COVID, there was also an immediate response from the community. And somehow the crisis, the response to the crisis renewed the sense of unity. But it was eventually fractured by the heavy military presence. Military and presence in the community was an approach resorted to by the Philippine government at that time as well. Now, the current status, so there is still ongoing construction by the big company, and some residents have been convinced as well to self-demolish and in a way relocate. But those who used to push for on-site redevelopment are now negotiating for specific relocation sites within the city. It's like they're compromised because some of the members are saying, we've been fighting for this for more than a decade. It's probably time for us to, in a way, come up with a compromise with the Quezon City government. So this is the city mayor, and then you have some of the community leaders. Yeah. I would end with some key lessons and challenges. This is my last slide. The support from professionals, the planners, the architects, most of the volunteers, the Save San Roque volunteers are actually young planners, architects, volunteer architects and educators. And they've been very important in trying to make the language of planning more accessible to local residents. Because we're talking about urban poor here, the poorest of the poor in the metro. Now, one implication of that is that the grassroots campaign has been criticized for being middle class led. And there are tensions. When I talk to the young volunteers, they would always say, yes, this is middle class campaign, but we always consult with the community leaders. They define the vision, they define the strategy, but we just execute. But still, there is that always criticism. It's a middle class led campaign. Aside from that, of course, we also recognize that the role of intermediary groups, people like us, actually, the scholars, the students who go there, the volunteers, their role has been very critical in gaining political support from the middle class, even from some government officials who have become sympathetic to their cause. And then in November, Kim and I presented this Inventraset lens as a potential framework to better understand the dynamics of informality. Inventraset is informal vending, transport, and settlement. And here, we're trying to understand the demands and aspirations of the community or residents who are very much involved in informal economic activities. And we say that it's important if we come up with what I call proper urban renewal to understand the dynamics of informality. How many residents are employed through street vending? How many are accessing informal transport for their mobility? And how many are living in the informal settlement? And I think this is a promising lens through which we can come up with a viable and hopefully inclusive urban renewal in a context where you have very entrenched informality, but also limited state resources. And I would end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Renewal. Three very fascinating presentations. I think the last one asking quite pertinent questions of the first two, perhaps. This notion of what proper renewal is and the question of renewal for whom. Maybe we can pose that question to kick off discussions to Min and to Paul.
The ultimate question.
Well, I think, do you mind if I start?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, but I think, well, in the Perth context, the redevelopment that's going on, the urban regeneration that's going on in the urban core is part of a luxurification process that's happening in CBD. So it's, to borrow the word, middle class. It's basically you're creating a wealthy enclave within the Perth CBD. Both in terms of people who live and work and consume Perth and the CBD, but also people who might come and visit as well. And just kind of look at it by the type of hotels that are, so the Ritz-Carlton as an example, the Westin Hotel is another example. These aren't motels, these aren't motor inns, and these aren't pitched at lower end of kind of tourist market stuff. It's all at the upper end of the income scale, basically. And I think that's just where regeneration has always been in many senses, but it's just that I think it's become more ostentatious. But it is in no way surprising to me.
Is MetroNet doing something different in the suburbs?
So, well, MetroNet's it's bringing the suburbs closer to the city. So in terms of traveling by time, and by having this extended network and stuff. But ultimately, what I think will happen is there may be a public transport benefit from it, but it's only going to add the land values. So it's going to push up land values over time, particularly in more kind of middle ring station precincts, are those that become, wherever they might be, those that become particularly popular, basically. And then land values, property prices around there will just shoot up very quickly, basically. So then there'll be a question, somewhere down the line, there'll be a question like, this is unaffordable. And again, of course, this is going to happen. This is not surprising. No. So
In the case study I presented, there are two contradicting groups. The plan by the right wing supports landowners because landowners will be able to build higher density development so that they can achieve greater development gains. The plan by left wing supports tenants and shop operators who have been there for long without the land ownership. And his plan wanted to retain those existing tenants and existing residents, minimizing forcible displacement. And the renewal for whom question is pretty fundamental philosophy. Whom are you going to support? Are you going to support rich landowners, or are you going to support the residents and grassroots people there in the local area? And many people might think supporting the grassroots approach is more humanistic and it's more valuable. But indeed, what happens to the built environment is there's almost no change if they go for retaining the current residents. So this is kind of sacrificing the overall public goods and public benefits, because other than the residents, no people can benefit by visiting the central area, but redeveloping into fancy and modern skyscrapers can benefit the landowners only, and so that they can recoup all the gains primarily. Although it can benefit society-wide and more new industries can come up and business operations find it useful to be there. But it's pretty difficult to evaluate. And if the high-rise buildings are placed there, possibly the small-scale narrow alleys will disappear. Then what the benefit from the small scale will also disappear as well. And it could be very similar to anywhere else. It will lose the local identity and local character, but it has become just anywhere in the world, in the business center. So it's kind of a conundrum that planners are facing. So yeah, I don't know. But I personally support the grassroots approach is a good one. It is the direction, but its environmental outcome is not the desirable.
Sort of know where your vote is leaning now.
Yeah, I'll ask a question. Something that came up for me, it was really identified in that last slide by you, Redden, is the role of planners and how, what's their reckoning around some of the, Perth, obviously, like what's going on there. in terms of capitalism. Sure. And we've got examples of that here, but what's interesting to me is, as someone who teaches planning, as we all do here in different ways, what our role is to prepare planners for the hostility of the development organization, the capitalist structure, whatever it is, the way power works in these different places. I think it's really interesting to see through Redden's work the role of community-driven planning and the ways in which planners, street-level bureaucrats, I know Redden talks a lot about that in terms of building like allyship, but what is the potential sort of in Korea and in Australian cities for planners to do that more political work rather than the mandated work or the technical work, which seems to be the main domain of what planners are up to these days. That's a very big critique of dark assessment of planning that I teach and love, but.
Look, I can only speak directly to the kind of the Perth experience. Is this the superstructure now around, if we take planning as part of the public service or public administration, it's wrapped up around political administration. And in Perth, there's no real left and right in government anymore. They're both two shades of neoliberalist governments. They both support property development. And if anything, the state Labour government in the way probably exceeds the Liberal government in its thirst for property development. You just have to look at where the Minister for Planning goes, which is at an urban development institute, golf, dinner, breakfast, or whatever, basically. So, there's a very cozy, close relationship between the planning minister and all planning ministers in the property development industry, basically. In Perth, there's a very strong growth mentality because we're a resource-based economy. We have a hang-up in some senses about being, Perth's a big country town. So there's an expansionist attitude with key players, in and around the city from the big end of town, but also political players and so forth, that Perth can be something bigger than what it is. And all those actors, what's happening is Perth, I think the play that's going on is people are trying to convert Perth from being a suburban palette to an urban palette, because urbanism is seen as being more dynamic, a better outcome in policy and political terms in the meta sense. What happens on the ground in this, in the sense of what's happening in Redden's example, we don't have those communities per se. It's not to say that there's no poverty and disadvantage and stuff, but it's not concentrated. That it's not, don't live in the same kind of informal settlement arrangements and stuff like this here. So it's not as explicit. It's very dispersed because it is a very suburban palette. Disadvantage and poverty is very diluted because it's spread throughout the metropolitan region basically as a whole.
Yeah, I think this poses questions in terms of how democracy manifests and its practice in each of these cities as well. Like in Manila and Quezon, it seems so raw and direct. You see the political players, you see the developers, you see the grassroots movement. But in Perth, it seems like
Well, there are, because it's middle class people who oppose density, densification, homeowners and stuff, and so they're they get branded, labels, stigmatized as NIMBYs and so forth, basically, is that right or wrong? Well, you have to be in their shoes to understand things. I think we all have a tolerable limit on things, where we will all be a NIMBY and we will all be a neoliberal on at least one thing, basically. So we have a tolerable limit on something.
I'm aware of time. We have maybe 3 to 5 minutes left. Let's open it to the wider audience.
I have a question actually for Paul.
Okay.
Because you said that there are middle class groups, homeowners associations. To what extent are they, for instance, using this issue as an electoral issue to exact accountability?
In the last state election, actually, when before the Labour government took over, the leader of the Liberal government, Colin Burnett, he came under quite sustained media and local community protest from the western suburbs. So the western suburbs in Perth is the wealthy suburbs in Perth. That's where the lawyers and the miners and basically all live. And so people there were opposed to a number of his policies, not just in urban regeneration. One thing was local government amalgamations. So there was a massive kind of reaction against him in his electorate, but then in the wider western suburbs, basically. So it's the mobilization of all of this soft power and automatic power that kind of the wealthy people have, basically, in order to politicize the system. And ultimately he lost the election. And there were a whole bunch of other reasons as well going on. I'm not going to say that was one reason, but it was he had done 2 terms already. It was time for change as much as anything else as well. But he faced a lot of opposition, which was very personal, as well as policy and political. You know, so it came on 3 fronts to him. But I mean, there have been some major wins on environmental groups have proposed. There was an extension of the Row 8, which is a massive ring road around Perth. It was going to go through the Beeliar wetlands, and there was opposition down towards Fremantle. There was massive opposition to that. Going into the election, the Liberals were going to develop Row 8, and Labour said, we will not develop Row 8. And they won on that issue, basically. They won on that front, quite massively. And it was very much in their platform, because they could sense, the Labour Party could sense that there was a political opportunism here. Now, have the Labour Party not built roads? Of course they haven't. They're building just as much roads, more roads than they're building 72 kilometres of heavy suburban rail. The amount of investment in roads in Perth under the Labour government is massive, you know, because we're a car-based suburban society.
In a way, broadly, this sort of competition between cities for investments as well, and it seems to be a competition towards sort of homogeneity. You know, I think one key word that you raised that's quite interesting, brutalscape, because brutalism seems to be making sort of a comeback in a way as well. But you know, that aside, yeah. Any last comments on that, maybe? And we have another question from.
That's a good question.
Yeah,
thank you for 3 excellent presentations. It's a question for Paul as well. Just in terms of the redevelopment, revitalization, you mentioned that I think the local conditions had 2 decades ago, with things like PM, you know, a naming kind of suggestion did not get up. Did they have any voice in this process at all? Most recently, was there any attentiveness to their connection to that part of the country?
If you read some of the documentation that's come out from the MRA, that they started to use a lot of kind of the indigenous language and terms, and they were starting to look in that direction in a way. But whether there's substance to it or not is, you know, left hanging basically. Maginn Square, which is in Perth CBD, which is part of the Perth link. So it links the CBD over to North Bridge, which goes over the railway line, because the city was divided. So again, the naming of Elizabeth Quay and the naming of Maginn Square was done under Colin Burnett's leadership. And Maginn is the wrong name to be using for that location as well. So there's dispute and there's conflict, even within the indigenous communities within Perth about what it should be called. It's seen as in overall terms, it's seen as an inappropriately named location, because it's not paying respects to the person that does have a claim to that particular space that Maginn Square sits on, basically. And Elizabeth Quay was just, you know, was classic conservative, liberal, you know, automatic nod the wings to, you know, the colonial past. And because Chogham was on as well, just a way of Burnett capitalizing on all of those things. You know, Chogham had come to Perth, I think, for the first time in 2011, and this was a big deal. You know, this is putting us on the map. Yeah, so and there's other things. Harrison Island's another contested space, which is over near East Perth, and the casino went on to say. But that's disputed land. There's a bridge now that connects East Perth over to where up the stadium is. I never remember the name of it, but it's got an indigenous name. So there's soft recognition in some ways, you know, but whether or not there's being committed, you know, what we consider deliberative or participatory planning and regeneration going on, you know, it's a question.
Okay, if there are no more questions, we can continue informal discussions outside. He is waiting. And I think this is an appropriate ending with the soundtrack from K-pop.
You can
So please join me in thanking the presenters today.